Imagine this. You're a French ambassador in 16th century Venice. You're not greeted by a minister, an advisor, or a cardinal. Instead, a woman in silk meets you, a volume of Plato in one hand and a list of your political weaknesses in the other. She holds no official title, but without her approval, you won't get a single contract. And if she leaves the room, your alliance will collapse faster than you can say, "Gondola!" She's not a lover. She's a courtesan. And she knows exactly why you're here. She knows you won't move an inch until she says yes. Subscribe to our channel if you enjoy slow, rich historical deep dives where history isn't just a list of dates, but a stage full of living roles. And be sure to drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is there. We're always curious to know where in the world history still echoes, even if you're in a bathrobe like a proper Venetian diplomat. When people today hear the word courtesan, they often imagine a woman draped in silk against a backdrop of frescoes, holding a glass of wine and a hint of sin. But in reality, the courtesan was a historical paradox. She lived in a world where women had no voice, yet she was the one conducting conversations that shaped the fate of states. In 15th to 16th century Venice, women had clearly defined roles: to be silent, faithful, domestic. A respectable wife wasn't expected to read much, certainly not to write. Her world was the home and the children. Yet there existed another model, a public woman, dazzling, intelligent, educated, desired. She was chosen not just for the night, but for the dinner table of diplomats. Enter the courtesan, a woman who could not only please but debate, play the lute, quote Cicero. She was valued not just for her body, but for a blend of charm, intellect, and social finesse. She knew when to stay silent and when to dismantle a doge's argument in 3 words. This phenomenon didn't appear out of nowhere. Venice was a city of merchants, not knights. Here they valued deals, control, and subtle manipulation. And who better than the courtesan to play all 3 at once? Venice was a city where even sin had an accounting ledger. By the 15th century, the number of women in the profession was so high that the state decided enough with fighting it, time to monetize. Official brothels were established under a state body that managed not only taxes, but morality. Prostitutes were issued licenses. They had to live in designated districts, wear specific clothing, and work set hours. Everything regulated, like the Navy. But out of this lower-tier market emerged a distinct class: courtesans. These weren't the women waiting in alleyways. They were invited to dinners with senators, receptions, even, on occasion, sessions of state. They didn't live in brothel zones. Their homes resembled salons with libraries, musical instruments, paintings, and, crucially, they had a contract, not just with a client, but with society. They didn't merely provide services. They were integrated into the political system as unofficial channels of influence. That's why the state didn't fight them. It regulated, protected, and used them. Becoming a courtesan required more than beauty. It demanded intelligence and endurance. In Venice, where the elite prized wit as much as the body, these women trained not only as dancers, but as orators, poets, musicians, and actresses. They knew how to captivate a room without removing a single gown. Education was key. Courtesans studied not just languages, Latin, Greek, French, but also philosophy, rhetoric, classical literature. They were trained to converse with senators, argue with theologians, and speak to cardinals in ways that made them forget their vows of celibacy. Some owned private libraries, funded artists, and wrote themselves. Among them, one name stands out: Veronica Franco. She wasn't just charming. She was a writer, intellectual, and cultural figure. Her poems were bold, ironic, filled with sensuality and politics. She publicly debated moralists, wrote letters to King Henry III, published books, defended herself in court against accusations of heresy, and won. Veronica was a favorite of both the social and intellectual elite, and at the same time, a woman the church sought to destroy as a debauchee. But her power lay not in her body, but in her mind, her words, her ability to bridge the world of women with the world of male politics. If a state cannot defeat vice, it registers it. That's not cynicism. That's Venice. Here, where merchants valued gold more than morality and diplomats visited brothels more than churches, the government turned prostitution into a public service with benefits. In 1509, the Venetian Senate passed a decree. Courtesans could work openly, provided they wore recognizable symbols, paid taxes, and didn't disrupt city life. Prostitution didn't just become permitted, it was embedded into the urban economy. Taxes from brothels funded bridges, sewage systems, and even education. It was a system resembling a guild, with hierarchy, rules, even a professional code. A courtesan wasn't just a body. She was an economic unit, and sometimes a strategic asset. The state even began promoting courtesans, not directly, of course, but by supporting festivals, parades, and balls where they were central figures. The Venetian courtesan was no longer a shadowy figure. She was a public persona, nearly an ambassador of beauty and pleasure. A courtesan, unlike a prostitute, didn't work per session. She signed a contract, often written for days, weeks, or even months. It outlined everything: payment, conditions, gifts, even the number of visits. But it wasn't just a deal for intimacy. It was a social agreement, opening doors to influence, status, and even politics. Ambassadors arriving in Venice had no official guide to the elite. But the fastest way to the city's heart wasn't through canals. It was through the salon of an influential courtesan. There, one could meet senators, artists, confessors, officers, in an atmosphere softened by vermouth and Horace quotes. These women knew more about the city's state of affairs than most men in robes, and crucially, they knew how to monetize that knowledge for themselves, for their protégés, or even for allied states. There are documented cases where preliminary diplomatic communication took place through courtesans. Unofficial, but entirely effective. Sometimes decisive. One striking episode involved courtesan Bianca Moretti, who received lavish jewelry from a Spanish envoy in exchange for assistance with Senate negotiations. When the deal fell through, he demanded the jewels back. She responded with a public poem accusing him of intellectual impotence and comparing him to a donkey. She won. The envoy was recalled. In the foreign policy of 16th century Venice, one rule held: official words didn't always work. In diplomacy, what matters is not only what is said, but where, when, and by whom. When Venice dealt with the papal curia or the Ottoman Porte, formal envoys often hit bureaucratic walls. But backstage, other forces moved. At this point, a courtesan might appear, one familiar with a certain legate or a relative of a sultan's negotiator. She bore no crest, but could achieve more than any official delegation. She received no salary from the treasury, but might prevent a war or enable an alliance, sometimes simply by knowing whom to speak to, when, and behind which closed door. One such tale features Lucrezia Salvi, who in 1537 hosted a secret meeting with a French envoy at her home, resulting in a temporary trade agreement. No treaty was ever signed, but it prevented a French tariff on Venetian textiles. No official decree honored her, but Venetian merchants remembered and thanked her with gold. Thus, a courtesan became a weapon of peace, as potent as a fleet of galleons. In 16th century Europe, a woman who could read was suspicious. One who read in Latin, dangerous. And if she quoted Aristotle, composed poems, and debated ambassadors, she was likely not a nun, but a courtesan. Venice gave rise to a unique cultural phenomenon. Female intellect became a status symbol. Being a courtesan meant not only allure, but also education. That's why the most respected courtesans didn't just entertain, they shaped elite tastes, served as muses to artists, corrected letters, advised in rhetoric. They could compose sonnets and edit diplomatic dispatches. They understood legal nuance and literature. Their salons resembled philosophical clubs more than houses of seduction. It was a revolution without a manifesto. A woman allowed to be intelligent and paid for it. In Venice, the intellectual courtesan became a fashionable symbol, no less than fine clothing or exotic fruit at the table. Visitors from abroad admired not only the canals, but the city's women who could speak so brilliantly, after 3 sentences, you wished to never leave. Senators sought them out, not for their bodies, but their minds. These were the places where sharp phrases, clever aphorisms, and rhetorical flourishes were born. Lines later echoed in government halls. Courtesans wrote poetry, but they also helped others write. Some statesmen secretly turned to them for help, crafting positions in diplomatic letters or speeches. Others simply wanted their arguments to sound more persuasive. And who better to refine persuasion than a woman who convinced the most powerful men daily? Thus emerged a paradox. The most educated women in Venice were not nuns or lawyers' wives, but courtesans. They created an intellectual class, voiceless in law, but powerful in influence. Veronica Franco wasn't just a courtesan who wrote poems. She was a political poet, a new archetype, smart, independent, influential, and not just in salons, but in public. Her poetry was sharp, erotic, yet deeply philosophical. She wrote not just about love and desire, but about power, honor, the place of women, and even geopolitics. Her works were read in public squares. She was invited to debates. She was respected and feared. When accused of heresy, a common threat to educated women, she didn't respond with silence, but with words. She won her trial because she knew the law better than her accusers, quoting Seneca and Augustine before the Inquisition. Her letters to King Henry III of France weren't sighs of longing. They were political missives. They combined situational analysis, diplomatic tact, and a touch of flirtation as a tool of influence. Diplomacy on parchment, not written by a chancellor, but by a woman society called sinful. In truth, she was a voice of reason in an eroticized world. She could not be bought, only listened to. And that's why those who never listened to women listened to her. In grand politics, there are small pillows. Sometimes, where nighttime seduction occurs, A morning without war is born. In 16th century Venice, the line between physical pleasure and geopolitical decision-making was as thin as a silk nightgown. Bedside diplomacy is not a novelist's fantasy. It was a strategy used in a world where official diplomacy was too slow and letters too suspicious. When it was necessary to feel out the mood of the Pope, the Sultan, or the French court, the most effective channel sometimes lay through the bedroom, not the embassy. Courtesans were not only masters of the art of love, they were brilliant psychologists, observers, diplomats. Information passed through them. Rumors were tested, boundaries explored. Most importantly, they had access to an intimate level of trust no seasoned envoy could ever reach. Sources document the involvement of courtesans in concrete international processes. For instance, the alliance between Venice and France in 1574 was formally signed by officials, but prepared in bed. The French ambassador spent several weeks with Elisabetta Capello, a courtesan with deep ties to both camps. After their time together, the tone of negotiations shifted dramatically. The Pope disapproved, Spain panicked, but the alliance was signed. In an even juicier story, Venetian beauty Caterina Livio had a romance with an Ottoman envoy, through whom she passed peace proposals, bypassing official translators and intermediaries. The alliance didn't last, but negotiations dragged on for another year, giving Venice time to prepare its fleet. The most famous example is Lucrezia dell'Orto, who was favored in both worlds. She had ties to the Roman Curia and the French embassy. Thanks to her, Venice avoided the imposition of an ecclesiastical interdict after refusing to extradite a fugitive priest. Though this was never officially recorded, her name appears in private letters from the papal legate thanking her for clarifying the city's position. Was this classical diplomacy? No, but it was real geopolitics in a world where official words could cost lives or navies. Venice never shied away from unconventional tools, and a courtesan who could avert conflict was worth more than 20 consuls. It was a diplomatic ballet, where every glance and phrase was part of the game, and the most delicate moves weren't made in government halls, but in rooms where silence could speak louder than royal decree. In a city where every canal has ears and every shadow has eyes, the best spy isn't the one peeking through a keyhole. It's the one to whom everything is whispered in bed. In 16th century Venice, courtesans weren't just part of the elite. They were suspected because it was understood. A woman who can stay silent, or better, listen, can gather more secrets than 10 agents in wigs. Courtesans knew whom the ambassador slept with. They overheard generals' plans. They read between the lines of letters dictated to them for translation. Sometimes they wrote those letters themselves, but most importantly, they had emotional access. When a man is relaxed, undressed, and convinced he's surrounded by nothing but silk, candles, and the scent of musk, that's when truth slips out. Some courtesans played a double game. For one side, charming companions. For another, conduits of sensitive information. In letters from the Doge to the Senate, it's noted that certain public women had contact with foreign agents. Sometimes it wasn't betrayal, but a state assignment. The most famous case, the affair of Giulia Pallavicini. She had a close relationship with the Spanish ambassador, yet was suspected of links to French envoys. When, during tensions between Spain and Venice, there was a coincidental leak of arrest plans, the Senate launched an inquiry. The courtesan was summoned, gave a dazzling speech on her innocence, declared she was interested only in poetry and perfume, and was released. Espionage was never proven, but Spain withdrew its diplomatic mission for 6 months, and French merchants received new privileges. Venice was a city where secrets had perfume, where intelligence wore rings and quoted Ovid, and where the spy might be the one whose voice was heard only in songs, yet echoed in the chambers of power. Lorenza Barbari, Rome, late 16th century. While cardinals prayed for eternal life, she ruled the earthly one. Lorenza Barbari, a name once whispered in fear through the halls of the Holy See, was known as La Signora che Sussurra, the woman who whispers, because what she whispered could halt the ignition of a European war. Born to a noble but impoverished Florentine family, Lorenza came to Rome where mastery of speaking and silence could raise a woman higher than any ambassador. She swiftly gained the favor of a cardinal, rumored to have carried her portrait in his prayer book, but her true influence began during mounting tensions between the Papal States and France in the 1590s. At a time when the Vatican considered imposing an interdict on French territories over customs conflicts, Lorenza intervened. Through private channels, she conveyed a message nuanced enough to convince Pope Clement VIII that escalation was premature. An archivist later noted, "The signal came via Barbarella. She said enough, and no more." Accused of espionage, she calmly replied, "I only repeated what men already knew. I just said it more gently." Upon her death in 1603, parts of a cardinal's archive mysteriously disappeared, but dozens of poems written in her honor survived, and with them, evidence that in a time when women were barred from sacred halls, Lorenza influenced which doors were opened. Anne Louise Piney, Paris, 17th century. In Paris, where beauty often eclipsed reason, Anne Louise Piney turned intellect into her most seductive weapon. Called the poetic fury and the philosophical sinner, she became a muse and brain of political salons alike. Raised by a humble notary, she devoured Montaigne and Plato before the age of 16. As a courtesan, she did not merely entertain elites, she shaped them. Her salon on Rue Saint-Honoré drew ministers, dramatists, and royal advisors. But her most critical work happened behind closed doors. In 1626, a controversy erupted over the golden mark, a symbolic coin tied to crown and parliament power. It was Piney who, through poetic metaphor, transmitted a subtle warning from one of the king's advisors. The verse read, "A coin, like honor, is worth only until cracked." Thanks to her access via a finance minister lover, Piney influenced a temporary tax distribution scheme that eased tensions in provincial regions. Her essays and satirical verses were copied and passed secretly even after her exile. In 1631, she was formally accused of insulting the court, officially for immoral literature, unofficially for wielding too much political insight. Exiled to a villa near Pisa, she left a final note in her salon, "I do not leave Paris. Paris comes with me." Today, Piney is viewed as one of France's first public female political thinkers, where sensuality was not an endpoint, but the opening line of discourse. Agata Lantini, Marseille, Lisbon, late 16th century. Agata Lantini wasn't Venetian. She didn't write in Latin or host poetic duels. But she built alliances between corsairs, diplomats, and merchants with a precision no treaty could match. Born to a tavern keeper and a cook in Marseille, Agatha grew up watching ships disappear into Atlantic fog and return with gold or news. By the 1580s, she was established in Lisbon, not as a maid, but as a strategic host in an officers' and merchants' establishment. In 1593, Lantini coordinated a series of informal dinners between Portuguese officials and English corsairs. These weren't social calls. They were secret negotiations to coordinate naval patrols and challenge Spanish shipping dominance. One English diarist noted, "Madame Agathe speaks little, drinks less, and hears everything." Her efforts led to a 1597 temporary agreement between fleets that secured safe passage for Allied vessels. The Portuguese government, without acknowledging it officially, rewarded her with a cultural diplomacy grant. When rumors linked her to British intelligence, she shrugged. "I simply fed my guests. They just happened to talk a lot." Agathe wasn't a lady of salons. She was a dockside strategist, a practical power broker whose influence sailed further than any official envoy. Every era has its nightfall, and the Venetian courtesans, those brilliant comets between eroticism and intellect, faded too, not because they lost their beauty or influence, but because the world around them changed faster than they could adapt. By the 17th century, Venice began to decline. Trade weakened, politics grew conservative, and the church tightened its grip. A wave of new morality swept in, along with repression of female public presence. What had once been a mark of elegance and worldly status was now branded as vice. Courtesans lost their legal status. They were persecuted as sinners. Driven beyond city walls, their salons closed. Education no longer held value. Now, piety was in vogue. Culture returned to the monasteries, and women's voices fell silent. Ironically, many who had once learned eloquence and taste from courtesans now watched their downfall in silence. Power pretended they had never existed, but memory is not so short. Some stories refuse to be silenced. One of them belongs to Theodora Morea, one of Venice's last great courtesans. In 1644, Theodora was no ordinary courtesan. She was an orator, a patron, a poet. Her salon hosted artists, scholars, and diplomats. She debated senators. She was even invited to public dialogues, unofficially, of course. But to the rising moralists, she was dangerous. When an anonymous anti-Catholic satire circulated, signed only T.M., the Inquisition acted swiftly. Theodora was arrested without trial. Her books, journals, and letters were seized. She was accused of doctrinal corruption, a term that by then meant thinking for herself. Her salon was called a nest of doubt. Witnesses, some former patrons, testified in silence. She was pressured to publicly repent. Theodora refused. She addressed the council herself, saying, "You fear my mind more than my body? That means I've already won." Days later, she was exiled from Venice, never to return. She died in Padua, alone and in debt. But in her final letter to a friend, she wrote, "When only one voice remains on stage, and it is a woman's, that's when they'll remember I was here." Her name became a whisper, then a legend. She was the last to openly resist. After her, courtesans faded into silence or submission. But her defiance became proof that a courtesan was never just a body. She was a woman who chose not to be quiet, when quiet would have been easier. Today, Venetian courtesans are remembered not as shameful figures, but as symbols of agency. They didn't just inspire, seduce, or entertain. They influenced politics, forged alliances, and wrote history, even without signatures in archives. Their names return in books, films, and studies, not as objects of desire, but as subjects of power. Because wherever word, passion, and wit converge, the Venetian courtesan will always be near, with a glass of vermouth and a smile that reads deeper than any royal decree. If you've stayed with us this far, thank you. You've just walked through salons, shadows, and secret rooms that shaped Europe more than most battlefields. Subscribe to our channel if you love deep dives into strange, rich corners of history. Stories full of irony, drama, and hidden strength. And tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is. We're always curious. Where do courtesans still echo?